would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Good evening and welcome to the Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster, who's all the way in sunny Thousand Oaks, California, and Dan Williamson, who's up in the Northwest. It's a little cooler up there. They're going to have freeze tonight up in Wisconsin. I'm John Bona. I'm your host down here in beautiful, sunny Vero Beach. Good evening, guys.
Good evening, John.
Good evening, John.
Well, it's good to hear your voice again, Marshall and Dan. And we're talking about, this is our continuing series on the economy and how to fix a recession, how to fix our economy. And, I think most people in America, in business for sure, everybody I talked to, they know the American economy in general. Now I'm speaking. And this is both sides of the aisle. This isn't a political thing. We know we've strayed away from the Constitution, most people I'm saying, in its medium of exchange, the money supply. And we'll focus on that tonight. You know, we can have, the good news is, folks, we can have an honest money system as we once had with a precious metal standard. We could avoid all unnecessary inflations that happen from time to time by eliminating the printing of new money that our famous Federal Reserve does all the time. You know, guys, I had an idea. I had an idea to stop the printing of new money. You know, it's to make the Federal Reserve use an HP Photo Smart printer like mine. And, my printer needs ink every month. So I figure if they run out of ink, that's the solution, right? But seriously, our founders knew the importance of having an honest money system. And that would encourage investment, a good economy, a good long-term economy, and yes, savings. Now, it's interesting, Marshall, I know you're with the World History Institute, and for 30 years you've been telling these stories forever and ever. I recently read one about the Revolutionary War, and you could explain it in more detail than I can, that history reveals that America could have actually lost a battle for its independence during the Revolutionary War because the money supply was not sound, and it sunk so low it wasn't even worth 1 penny. A dollar wasn't even worth a penny because of inflation. You know, this paper money came to be known as Continentals, had become worthless. You probably heard the expression, not worth a Continental. But they knew, our government knew there must be an inflation-proof currency for it to survive economically. Therefore, the United States government was really not empowered to print money. That may be a surprise to some people. It could coin money out of gold and silver or print bills that were redeemable in gold or silver, but it could not print worthless paper money, fiat currency. So Congress established before the Constitution was adopted that our money supply would be backed by a precious metal, gold or silver. And all other coins, both foreign and domestic, would be valued in terms of the USA silver dollar. I haven't seen a silver. I can't tell you the last time I seen a silver dollar. Have you guys seen a silver dollar? Dan, you got a bunch of them, I guess.
I got a few silver dollars, yes.
I can't tell you the last one I've seen one. But
they're out of circulation. Anybody gets a heavy any coin, they keep it because they realize that silver dollar is now worth up over $100.
Dan,
it's worth a huge amount of money.
Dan, if you got so many, sell me one for $100. Well, yeah, I'll buy it. But, eventually the gold standard was returned, and then until 1933, right, Marshall, when everybody had to.
Right, $10,000 fine and imprisonment for 1 year if you didn't turn in your gold. I think you're given 15 days or 30 days to turn it in. And believe it or not, many, if not most people, actually did it.
And what did you do? I mean, if you didn't,
an ounce.
you could keep your jewelry though, right?
Well, maybe your jewelry, but the point is you lost your gold, and your gold was all your coinage, which was, which was the thing that obviously was worth, was going to be worth, 100 times that amount later on. But it was the attempt of the federal government. It's been tried by nations throughout history to shave the currency, to control the gold. Whoever has the gold rules, and that's really true. And if you shave the currency through inflation by cheating, taking away the gold and giving people paper, you keep the gold, give the people paper, and the paper becomes then worthless currency. Even after that, you were to have gold or silver certificates in paper. But then in 1971, Richard Nixon took us completely off the gold standard, and those certificates now are just Federal Reserve notes. So they're basically worthless pieces of paper. That worthless piece of paper is only good because the average housewife takes it and goes to the grocery store and buys something with it and still has faith in it. As soon as the American people lose their faith in the dollar, and the rest of the world is losing faith right now, as soon as they lose faith in it, the dollar will become worth less, and less, until it's like Argentina, where it's 1,000 to 1, what it was between a 3-year period time frame back in 1999. So I mean, it's happened there. It's happening right now in Greece. It's happening, and it's happening in Europe. There's a collapse of Europe going on right now, and the collapse of the euro. It's happening with the dollar because all of these. There's not a country left in the world that is now gold-based, and yet our Constitution dictates that the Congress shall coin money. It was interesting in the debate last night. One of the people said, who was running for president, said, "Oh, of course, I don't want to trust the Congress to coin money. That's why I'm in favor of the Federal Reserve being a neutral body controlling the money supply." And I thought, well, wait a minute. What does the Constitution say? The Congress of the United States is to be the controller of the currency because there are representatives. Do we want an unaccountable group of bankers who we have no control over controlling our currency, or do we want our elected representatives?
Dan, I've heard you talk about, dross in the coinage, and I think it was LBJ, wasn't it, who started, he took a lot of silver out of the silver dollar, didn't he, in the quarters?
Oh, absolutely. And, I teach this quite often here. We homeschool our kids, and we tutor a lot of other kids, and I can put a $20 gold piece on the table, and I put a $20 Federal Reserve debtor note on the table, and I point out to youngsters, I said, look, in 1880, this $20 gold piece bought a good-looking suit, undergarments, shoes, cane, cap, hat, beaver skin probably, and an umbrella, and maybe even got you the start of a sidearm, and, pretty well outfitted you. Now take this $20 bill, which at one time, gold and dollars were 20 to 20. You could redeem them, as Marshall said. You go in, you take your $20 gold certificate, you get $20 worth of gold back, a $20 gold piece. And take that same $20 bill today, the American Federal Reserve note, and go in and try to buy much. You would be lucky if you could buy a, dinner for 1 3/4 at a local restaurant. However,
3 Big Macs and some shakes.
What's that? Yeah, right, Marshall. Hamburger and a couple of shakes. And yet if I take that $20 gold piece and I walk down to, and I convert it over to dollars, I can still buy a suit, hat. It has retained its value because gold is a standard that God has set, gold, silver, and you can go right back into the Bible and see that God sets these standards way back in Genesis, that's the standard. That standard will hold. Whether we completely understand why gold and silver hold value is kind of irrelevant. It simply does because God says it does. But it also goes back to this concept that it is an actual commodity. And when I take a loaf of bread that my daughters have ground the wheat and baked the bread and they sell it, they get money. The problem with that is the money is losing value immediately because they keep raising the debt ceiling and printing more dollars. So if they sell their commodity that is actually useful for dollar bills, the first thing they need to do is convert those dollar bills over to gold and silver as quick as possible because they lose value all the time. That's why Congress had an incredible opportunity this summer to stop the devaluing of our dollars by stopping the raising of our debt ceiling. If the Federal Reserve had been stopped from printing more money, there would be less and less demands on our $1 bill. Right now, it's 35 to 1. It used to be 10 to 1. It used to be 1 to 1. So we're losing value because the taxpayer is the one that guarantees those debtor notes. And they are not, they're debtor notes. You have to pay them off. That's why there's another whole issue. What's left of our economy once you pay the debt notes off? Maybe nothing. That's a different discussion we can have in a few minutes. But we've lost value in our money because it's hidden tax inflation, because we're printing so much money. And then it's a faith effort. There's no commodity really holding up the value of that dollar bill. It's fiat money.
Well, right. I'd like to ask the question and then give an answer, too. You know, if 5,000 years of gold holding its value, its purchasing power, right? If that doesn't give it a right to be a measuring tool, a yardstick, then what tool do you use? What is the yardstick? Paper money? Of course not. And, you know, let's face it. Look, we're America is left right now with a fiat currency, right? That's what we have now, 2011. Paper money with no precious metal backing. Now, today, because of several court decisions, the U.S. government is able to do that through the Federal Reserve, this privately owned entity through international banks. And so the economy suffers the rigors of inflation on and off because of this. You know, we hear a lot about fiat money. And, you know, the Greenwood Press defined it as money not backed by gold or silver and created by the will of the government. Like you said, they just print it. Now, here's what the point I'm making. You know, what is the problem, someone may ask, with the government simply printing money to pay its bills? That's what it does. You talked about it, Dan, that the amount of printed money in circulation is pretty close to the debt, isn't it?
It is.
So here's the problem, as I see it, and I think it's obvious, that these new dollars do not represent any goods or services that adds value to the society. Look, when a furniture company makes a piece of furniture or a plumber fixes a leaky faucet, that adds value for someone. Somebody makes a computer or a sound system. But just putting paper money into banks does not contribute any real value to the economy at all. All it does is the probability of inflation goes up because we have more money in the economy causing higher prices for the same amount of goods and services. Now, probably to the surprise of many, our federal government, as I understand it, really does not make money. The federal government has handed this duty to the Federal Reserve, privately owned. And it's given it the sole power to print money by this fractional reserve bank system controlled by international bankers. You know, I haven't seen a freshly crisp printed dollar in a while. I guess there's a lot of them out there. But I know the government uses those dollars to pay its bills. And we're spending billions and billions on these different government-sponsored programs, welfare programs. That's how we pay for it, right, Dan?
Right.
I don't know if...
Despite the fact it's unconstitutional, which is an interesting discussion all in itself, I mean, the Constitution says they're supposed to have the power to what? Mint gold and silver coinage. I really don't understand constitutionally how we've allowed ourselves to be in this spot. But it's even more remarkable when you take this concept called GDP, gross domestic production or gross domestic product, and understand the only two ways to grow it, to grow our GDP, is increase the population of working age individuals, who then can go out and increase their productivity or produce more. Well, nothing in that formula that I just stated is printing more dollar bills. And John, you were right on. Printing more money does nothing to really add to the economic picture. It just adds more dollars that create inflation that lowers the value of our money. In other words, lowers our purchasing power. And this is where people are really finding themselves in a box right now. With the economy and the condition it's in, there's a couple areas that most people heading into retirement are relying on: the value of their house, their personal investments, and maybe Social Security and some kind of pension. So the house value is down 32, 33, 40%. So that's one strike. Two, their investments in 401ks, IRAs, whatever, are also down. And by the way, most of this is happening because of this inflation of our money. In other words, it's having less and less value. And last but not least, they go to get their pension check and their Social Security, and it buys only half as much as they thought. So they head into those retirement years with this game plan in place that is changing literally by the month. And you see little notes in the computer and on your TVs that more and more people are saying, well, I've got to work till I'm 72 and 77 and 78 because there's no way I'm going to retire. They may never catch this bubble because if the housing values stay as they are and 401ks and IRAs and other investments continue to sit in the doldrums and inflation eats away at their purchasing power, which is that fiat money, they may never catch up with inflation. They may have to rely on their other family members to help them out. This is all part of this very vicious cycle. And Marshall, you've said it so often, you don't break God's law breaks you. Fortunately, when we're being judged, it's also a good time to realize when God judges, He also is saying He loves us enough to judge us. So, this is what's going on. And we are a consumer-driven economy where 70% of our GDP is consumption by Americans buying American goods. So if we keep taking on this inflationary approach, which is also debt, because remember, we print these bills and then we secure them, they're debt bills, that delays consumption. Every time you take a debt, you've got to hold off buying things so you pay the debt off. Well, if we're a consumption-built economy, where 70% of it's built on Americans consuming and Americans are holding back, you can see the vicious cycle we're in. We need the consumption, but the money's not there to consume. So when some guy gets on the radio and says, boy, unemployment's great, it gets people all working and busy, that's an insane statement. It can't work because this is consumption taken from somebody else through taxation, handed to another group of people who may or may not consume because they're struggling themselves. So there's an illogical mindset or a perfectly theological mindset. It's just the theology is wrong. And that's what we're dealing with in our culture. We have a theology that's humanistic and socialistic, which is not going to work. It is going to fall apart. And, those of us who are Christians need to be braced for that and be ready to do the things we need to do. And it isn't just hunker down in a hole, but how do we teach our neighbors and friends how to get through this? So that's kind of what we're facing. Long-winded for a short answer, I guess.
I had a talk with my son this afternoon about what you talked about, Dan, the GDP, the gross domestic product. And I think our listeners should know what this is if they don't already. By the way, you could contact us and hear all of our programs on the economy and how we're going to fix this recession at thestoryofliberty.net. And, gross domestic product really, by the way, I majored in accounting and economics in college as well. But it's really, as I remember it, being explained to me and understanding it, it's kind of like the market value of all the goods and services produced in a country, during a period of time, say a year or whatever. So if you could imagine a business that produces computers, that would be their annual output of that piece of merchandise. But it also indicates a standard of living. And here's where it gets a little scary. Gross domestic product, because listen to these statistics. In 1932, the U.S. gross domestic product was worth about 2.8 billion ounces of gold. So everything that we produced, all the goods and services, was worth about 2.8 billion ounces of gold. Okay, we could understand that. In 1971, almost 40 years later, the gross domestic product was worth 28 billion ounces of gold, about 10 times as much. So the economy grew 10 times under that theory. Right, Dan? Makes sense. Well, in 2000, up to 2000, it grew further. The gross domestic product of America was worth about 34.5 billion ounces of gold. All our goods and services equalize that kind of value, 34.5 billion ounces of gold. Now, here's where it gets scary. 2011, the gross domestic product of our nation is worth 7.7 billion ounces of gold. Folks, that's a 77% decline in 10 years. I mean, do you hear what I'm saying? If that's not a contraction, look they say we're in a double dip recession. I'll tell you, I'm looking at statistics. This looks more like a depression to me. And I'm not here to bring bad news, but I'm just looking at the facts. And I don't see how you can have this kind of devaluation. I mean, that's a whopping 77% since 2000. And, of course, everyone will argue, about that analysis. And the main objection will be, well, you're viewing the value of the economy in terms of gold only. And I said that earlier. Well, what else do you value it by? Gold has been around, what, Dan, 5,000 years, right, as a valuation?
Absolutely.
So gold holds its purchasing power. Dan, you gave that example of, I love that example of a $20 piece, what it bought in, what was it, 1860?
About 1880.
And what it could buy today, it buys the same goods, right? Nice suit, pants, all that stuff.
You can buy a great car today.
There you are. You were so quiet, Marshall. I'm glad you're back.
Oh, I'm here.
We thought we lost you. Look, we got a minute left in the first half. Wind us up, Marshall. We thought we lost you.
Well, the key to this whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, I was an economics major at the University of California too, John, and that'll get you a quarter. That won't even get you a quarter. Certainly get you a silver quarter.
Yeah.
But the truth is that economists are the people you go to when you know you don't want to get an answer. If you want to get an answer, go to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah says, your silver has become dross. That means you have watered down your silver and made it a paper currency. Your wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow come before them. What this passage is saying is that inflation caused by the devaluation of the currency, done by the princes or by the leaders of a society, is done for the very specific purpose of taking bribes and their own personal rewards so that they can destroy the wealth of the fatherless and the widow. That is a person on a fixed income. That is a person with limited income. Who gets hurt the most by inflation? The people at the bottom.
Folks, we'll be right back. Join us in the second half here for the Way to Fix the Economy with the Story of Liberty. Welcome to the Story of Liberty with Dr. Marshall Foster and Dan Williamson. I'm your host, John Bona, and we're talking about the economic crisis in America today and how to fix it. We think we have a good answer because we're looking at what the Lord says about the economy, God's way, and that's revealed in the Holy Scriptures. See, a nation's money is really tied to justice. And the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, tie a nation's money system, a monetary policy, to the concept of justice. And we will see, as Dr. Foster will explain, to the Lord, these two are inseparable. And we're going to talk about how our economy is functioning these days and the nature of its money supply. And Marshall, I know there's several scriptures, and I appreciate you being with us again and your wisdom on this issue. I think this is such a huge issue to keep our country afloat and from not being broken and ruined from the inside by this internal crisis of our money supply, right?
Well, exactly. And it's dealing with such a fundamental question of life. And this is where we have mistakenly put the concept of money and the monetary supply into the hands of economists and bankers, thinking that it's simply a decision that's made by eggheads who have studied it for a long time, and they can tweak some dials and keep us out of problems and bring us to prosperity. Of course, that's exactly the way the world does not work. The world works on a fundamental foundation of universal laws. If you jump off the Empire State Building, you fly like a bird for 3.5 seconds, and when your body hits the ground, every bone in your body cries out, yes, the law of gravity works. Yes, the law of gravity works. You see, you don't break the law of gravity breaks you. So that's true of all of God's laws, both his eternal laws seen in the physical universe and his spiritual laws and his economic laws. And so those laws are set out very clearly in Scripture. And that is why for the children of Israel, when they were given God's law, they were also given the concept of the just weight and measure. It says in Leviticus, "You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meteord, in weight or in measure. Just balances, just weight, a just ephah, and a just hin," these are pieces of currency, "shall ye have." They must be just. What does it mean by just, balances, and weights? It means the scales of justice that we all see that the woman of justice is holding, that has to be a perfect balanced scale in which there's a certain balance weight that has a certain weight, and that weight should be the weight of whatever piece of gold or a precious currency that you bring in. If it doesn't match up, or if it needs to, you have to give more to match that weight, then that's the way to tell. But the weight can't be messed with. In ancient Israel, they took the master weights for the entire civilization, and they were kept in the holy temple by the Levites. Why? Because they knew what would happen. Just like I said before, when the kings get in control, they would shave down the coins and steal some of the silver, and then they would put dross around the outside. They would melt down the silver and put dross in it and pass it off like a silver coin. Well, see, that is cheating. That is not justice. And the only way to avoid that is to have a master weight that does not change in value. Now, how does that relate to us? It relates very clearly to us because we need to see that these are eternal principles of how to maintain the wealth of individuals and private property. If you can allow your government, which we have allowed to happen, take over our currency, and Thomas Jefferson was very strong on this. That's why we shouldn't have a central bank. That's why we can't have bankers controlling our money supply because of the sin nature of men will always cheat through inflation. Because if they can print money, worthless currency, and not have it based by a just weight, which was what we used to have, where whether it was a piece of paper or a coin, it had to match up to a just weight of a certain amount of gold. If you do not have that, then the person in control can spend into oblivion, and the person at the bottom, the last person who gets the Ponzi scheme, which is really what it is paid off in currency that's worth 20% less, 30% less, 50% less. Pretty soon, he's got nothing in his pocket. And those that have paid off their debts are the government. And that's the way the kings have ruled since the time of the ancient world. This is nothing new, guys. And so we need to look at our current situation and say this is as relevant now as it was in ancient Israel. To go back to the truth, to go back to justice, is to go back to just weights and measures. And this will make it an even playing field for all. And people will not be cheating based upon the currency, especially those in power.
Marshall, I loved your analogy about skimming the edges of the coin. Micah 6:8 says, "Do justly, be merciful, and walk humbly before God." You think about how this ventriculates down. So here's a coin, and of course today we put ridges on the edge of the coin and a bunch of things to show that it's a whole coin, that no one's nipped the edges. But as you said, they used to clip the edges off, and they'd either remelt that down and make another coin, or they could put dross in there. But what's interesting is think about the next guy that gets the coin sees, well, all the edges of my coin have been clipped off, so why doesn't he clip the edges of his coin and pass it on another time? This is this sense of a lie that starts to become a vicious circle. When we say, do justly, be merciful, walk humbly before God, when we say, obey all the laws of God, and go back to Deuteronomy 13, which says, no dross in the money, that consistency has to go from every direction, from the king to the people, from the people to the king, because if the king starts to shave the coin, then why don't the people shave the coin? There's no truth. And people see through that. And pretty soon they go, well, what do I care if I pull some edges off the coin too? Because I've got to get my piece of the pie out and pass this coin down. Everybody is passing down a lie. God calls an abomination in your purse that you're carrying this lie because you're passing it down. It's no different when we transact the fiat money for real goods. We're giving money that's losing value every day, in other words, the coin's being snipped, for real goods and services, real things where somebody's actually fixed your car or someone has produced a loaf of bread that's useful. And in fact, it's a lie. And Jesus came into this world to testify to the truth. So we as Christians need to realize that although some of us are not trying to be in this vicious circle, we're drawn into it because we're transacting this same fiat money back and forth. And that's why there's this honesty and truth that has to settle into the Christian spirit and has to begin to move, as you put it, Marshall, with the balm of some grace and mercy, to start to push these changes back up the chain to make real currency worth a real value. But that will not come without some pain, because we've got ourselves in a hole, and to reprint coinage that's really backed by gold and silver, we have to face the fact that we've had a debt-based culture for at least 70 years. And that has to sort itself out. That means we first lose a lot of purchasing power because you've got to delay consumption because of debt, and that will cause some problems for a while that will require perseverance and long-suffering by Christians, especially looking on their neighbors and friends and trying to help them out as we get through this tough time. So the solution is there. We need to print real money that has real backing, that has a commodity value of some sort. And then we have a first point of truth, which the Bible says use gold and silver as a basis. It's not that it's just a good idea. The Bible tells us to do this. And frankly, Marshall, as you know, history's proven that out. Gold and silver keep marching forward, holding a degree of value in the culture regardless of what happens.
That's
right.
The crux of the matter, isn't it?
It really is, and it's as relevant today as it ever has been. But it has to be thought through. It has to be studied. And the Christian people, beginning with the Christian churches, need to begin to preach it from the pulpits, need to begin to teach these principles so that we can get away from the economy that destroys our own character. The real estate bubble we just went through in the 2000s, over the period from about 2000 to 2007, that bubble was caused by that same greed to get something for nothing on the part of millions of Americans, where the idea was, I don't have to work for my living. I can just buy and roll. And I can, because of inflation, they were counting on the fact that they can continue to make money. And as what the agents and then the various congressional agencies such as Freddie Mac and those guys, which were then loaning money to people who couldn't afford a house, you end up having these people getting involved, and it becomes a greed thing. We're going to get greedy. We're going to go get something. It's not that I need a house to live in. It's that I want to roll and get several $100,000 or $1 million in the next year so I can roll it again, and it becomes a lottery mentality. So we've got a society that's now, because of inflation, it's built in that you better get your money now. You better buy that new car now. you better get it now because your money's going to be worth less next year. And so there's a panic sets in, and whatever wealth there is ends up being spent. And that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. We need to pull in our horns. We need to rethink what we're doing, and federal debt and spending needs to be cut drastically, like 30% immediately minimum, and then up to 50%, I would think, or 60% over the long haul. That is the only solution, is a massive cutback in our spending at the federal and state and local level, the self-dependence of each independent family, and the calling and the choosing of representatives will put us back on a just currency that will not allow the government to spend more than it takes in, and will not allow them to have anything but balanced budgets, and will not allow the currency to be inflated. That is our only way out.
So we have a moral dilemma, don't we? It's a moral dilemma. As Washington said, a religious and moral people. And that's where we've got to start. I often make that statement. I've done it at a couple events where I've said, look at families that pray together, work together, eat together, and play together, stay together. And I really think that's where a lot of this has to start. We need to start teaching and then sitting with our neighbors and doing the same thing, communicating these ideas. I had someone the other day telling me all about the terrible events of the big farmer, and then the terrible the nature of McDonald's. And I said, don't forget, this is a moral problem. When families don't eat together, they run out and grab a McDonald's together, and McDonald's simply responds to that need. And that need is they need lots of hamburger, right? And so farmers respond by finding ways to mass-produce hamburger. And then with that came certain pathologies, behavior patterns, even dietary issues. But it's not necessarily McDonald's and the farmer's fault. It's a moral dilemma that goes right back to the family that never spends any time together. They run restaurant to restaurant, willy-nilly, high speed, all day long. And then that goes back to the moral dilemma that Mom and Dad are both working. There's no time for Mom to be home preparing a diet that's full of nutrition and good food. They're on a run, nonstop, trying to pick up kids. Well, why are we in that moral dilemma? Just what we're talking about. Money values, they just don't buy what they used to buy. So the job that used to make $35,000 a year and actually paid all the bills. I remember my dad said he got $2.95 an hour. How, wow, they had extra money to buy groceries and everything else. We've had such inflationary destruction to our currency that now Mom and Dad both have to work quite often. Now there's a little bit of, I want everything. I want a snowmobile. I want can you tell I'm in the north? We want a snowmobile. We want a boat, et cetera, et cetera. And those things in themselves are very nice, but we've lost purchasing power. Now Mom and Dad are both out there struggling to just pay the bills, and then the economy reacts to it like it has recently. And we have people in a pretty desperate situation, and they're thrashing. And so we really have a moral dilemma, and we have to deal with that moral dilemma, which means we've got to ask ourselves a question: what is our theology? What kind of a Christian are we? Do we really believe the Bible? Do we really have faith that the Bible will lead us in the right direction? And, of course, I do, and I know you and Marshall do, and you do, John, also. And that's really what we have to have some faith in. We got to believe the Word of God is true, and if we act upon it in the long run, we win.
And I understand, like sometimes I remember, like you, Marshall, in college, when some economic theories of economics, some of them defied common sense in a way. You know what I mean? But
oh yeah,
when I heard the White House press secretary, Jay Carney, he was talking about unemployment insurance maybe a few weeks ago, about creating jobs. And Mr. Carney explained that unemployment insurance is one of the most direct ways to infuse money into an economy, because people who are unemployed and obviously aren't earning a paycheck at that point in time because they're unemployed, they're going to spend the money that they get from the government. And he said that would create growth and income for business that then would lead to them making decisions about jobs, more hiring. They'd hire more people, more business. Now, when I thought that through, Well, if that isn't an answer from a PhD out of some liberal college, I don't know what is. It's nonsense. Think about it. What the White House is telling us is that the more unemployed people there are that we can pay for not working, we can pay for not to work, the more people will work. That's what he's really saying. Think about it. Now, as I said, only someone with a PhD in economics from some elite liberal university would believe that. And, you know, some of these things that come out of Washington just blow me away. The Center for American Progress held a forum earlier this month arguing that raising the minimum wage would create more jobs. Now think about that. For this to be true, anybody that runs a business, you'd have to believe that the more it costs you to hire a worker to run your business, the more workers companies will want to hire. Think about that. It doesn't make sense. And maybe the biggest whopper of them all was the discredited $830 billion stimulus bill. And now we've got, another $450 billion on the plate, right? And, you know, we were promised, I think, $1.50 or even up to $3 of economic benefit, right? That multiplier for every dollar the government spent. But there was never any acknowledgement publicly that for the government to spend $1, who does the government take the dollar from? Takes it from the private sector, from the workers, the investors, the earners. And that's supposed to create jobs. You know what? That multiplier theory, that only works if you believe in the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fairy tale.
John,
go ahead.
You proved it out in your data. They made the stimulus bill. They issued the money. And what did you say our GDP would purchase? 77% less gold and silver.
Right.
Checkmate. Checkmate. I mean, what the argument goes no further. It doesn't work. You can't take money from the people who make private investments and put it in government's hands and expect that would produce any GDP. That's debt-based GDP. It doesn't exist. There's a debt out there that has to be paid back. So consumption has to be deferred to pay the debt. It's a vicious cycle. It doesn't work. And your data you gave was perfect evidence. I mean, this is a chessboard that's done. They need to start a new game.
Gentlemen, this is what we're up against here is not something that is just bad policy. What we're up against is something that is depravity. Romans chapter 1 says that you go through, that societies and individuals go through stages of depravity, from immorality to massive immorality to giving up your ways with men and women to go for your own sex. And then it says you reach a point where what is right is wrong and wrong is right. We are reaching that point in our society where many in our society have come to the place, and we've all been brainwashed to one extent or to another, and this is true of both parties. Let's don't forget the amount of money that the Republicans have spent in the 2000s and back into the 90s. I mean, way over the amount of money that should have been spent. It never should have been borrowed like that. And so both parties and all Americans are accountable to some extent to the fact that we have allowed these depraved policies to destroy our children's futures. Now, what do we do about it? The answer is not, we can't just go, spit at people and say, you're bad and look what you've done to me, because we are accountable for bringing about these things upon ourselves. We must take accountability for our own, and like Dan said, take it to the dinner table, take it to the way in which we plant a garden, take care of our kids, tell our kids, this is what we're going to do. You're not going to go in debt. You're not getting a credit card. We're not going to allow you to go to college and have $40,000 worth of debt when you come out. We're not going to do these things. We're going to do things as God provides. And then secondly, and I think this is very important, gentlemen, because we're talking about things that affect people's lives here. And we don't mean to tell our audience that we're just these mean guys that are coming along saying, well, there's a Great Depression coming, so nah, too bad for you. We're not saying that. We're saying exactly the opposite, that what we need to do is be thinking about solutions, because it's coming whether we like it or not. And one of those solutions is private charity. You know, it's Marvin Olasky, in his marvelous book in which he wrote, it's called The Tragedy of American Compassion, one of the great economists of our time. He was the guy that came up with the idea of the supply-side economics and pushed it through, especially under the Bush era. But he is the guy that said, and studied it in his book, that in the 19th century, 90% of all charity and all welfare came from Christian sources, especially churches, individual foundations, and especially individual families. We need to be looking around at those that are hurting right now, and we need to be providing for those. Dan, you've done it through adoption already. John does it through his many charities. I do it as best I can with what I have. We've got to be looking at ways to help our fellow man in this very difficult time, and we've got to find ways to do it without the government paying for it, because that destroys character, rather than a private hand around the arm that says, you know, I will help you. How can you get out of this? How can we get out of this together? And feeding them if necessary. We have got to be thinking this way.
Well, folks, we're winding up our program this evening, and we hope you've enjoyed it. And you could check us out online at thestoryofliberty.net and hear any of our programs on the economy. You know, but as to wind up, as Elijah said many, many years ago, the great prophet, he said, if Jehovah be God, follow him. Now, to follow God and enjoy his covenantal blessings upon this great nation, we must abandon our love for the treasure of wickedness that we have taken on in our money supply. Unjust weights and measures. They're bad. And this means first returning to a love for God and his word, the Holy Scriptures, both testaments of the Bible. See, they were delivered. God's word was given once and for all. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. We could rediscover the wisdom and knowledge in that great book, and we could restore an honest currency tied to silver and gold, as our forefathers required us in the Constitution. Just read it, Article 1, Section 10. Thank you, folks, for joining us. God bless you. Have a good evening. See you next week. Good night.